We all recognize the $20 bill, and front and center on the bill is a heroic-looking Andrew Jackson. But what would Jackson's contemporaries, such as John C. Calhoun, think of him being on the bill, recognized for eternity? John C. Calhoun is a symbol of 18th century politics, a Southerner so stubborn he gained the nickname Cast Iron Man. He was also a great orator, despite his lack of charisma. He was a symbol for secession, urging the South to think of slavery not as a necessary evil, but a positive good. He was a political jack of all trades, constantly changing his political views, his political offices, and consequently his political allies. But his most lasting legacy was his term as vice president to Andrew Jackson. He began his vice presidency in political harmony with Jackson, but ended it bitterly, thinking Jackson had no concern for the South, and on the brink of war, though the Battle of Manassas was still more than a decade away. Calhoun hated Jackson and his glorified presidency, and was bitter about the subject all his life. Yet Jackson is on the $20 bill, while Calhoun is associated with a war he did not live to see. But Calhoun's sense of justice may be winning out. After all, Calhoun and Jackson both aboard the Bank of the U.S., and Jackson is on the currency of an institution he's hated so much: banks. In fact, Calhoun once said, "A power has risen up in the government greater than the people themselves, consisting of many and various and powerful interests, combined into one mass, and held together by the cohesive power of the vast surplus in the banks." But Calhoun's views changed constantly, so his views of Jackson's glory were different during every stage of his life. To know Calhoun's feelings is to know his complex life.
John Caldwell Calhoun and Andrew Jackson were vastly different people with vastly different backgrounds. In order to understand Calhoun and Jackson's different choices and influences, it is necessary to understand their lives. Andrew Jackson's father died a week before he was born, and he was raised between the North and South Carolina borders by a poor mother. Calhoun's father was a wealthy planter, and Calhoun led an opulent life on a South Carolina plantation. Jackson didn't have a good education compared to Calhoun, who was a thriving student at Yale. Instead of continuing his schooling, Jackson joined the local army regiment at the age of 13. With his brother, during the Revolutionary War, they served as couriers. Calhoun was raised in the Calvinist religion, but Jackson grew up in an agnostic family. While Calhoun was trained by his wealthy father, tutors, and professors, Jackson had no guidance in growing up. He relied on his instinct, groomed himself, and educated himself. General Jackson became famous for his bravery and tough attitude in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. Jackson took the intellectual route and started to become well known through his speaking and persuading abilities when elected to Congress in 1810 as a war hawk. Jackson was slightly different. He was a wild man who actually fought in the physical war, not in the political debates of whether or not there should be a war. He was an American frontiersman. Calhoun was a politician from the start. John C. Calhoun gained his popularity through fiery speeches, not through winning battles. Both of these men were advocates of slavery, but when Jackson became president in 1828, his beliefs did not include nullification and states' rights. Calhoun believed in slavery, calling it a positive good, but also thought that states could nullify federal laws if they thought them unconstitutional. After stints as a Secretary of State and Secretary of War, Calhoun turned to the presidency. Unfortunately, his stubbornness gained him the nickname Cast Iron Man, and he could only get enough votes for the vice presidency. Calhoun served with John Quincy Adams for a term and turned against the American system and nationalism during that period. Calhoun then became the vice president to Andrew Jackson, but resigned after clashes such as the Peggy Eaton affair and the nullification crisis. Jackson believed that the Union should be preserved, while Calhoun promoted sectionalism. Jackson dueled with multiple men, and many were fought in defense of his wife, Rachel's honor. He also supported Secretary of State John Eaton during the Peggy Eaton affair, where Calhoun's wife, Floride, snubbed Peggy Eaton, a woman with a past much like Jackson's own wife. Calhoun had no such record in regards to physical violence. Jackson suffered from multiple health problems and the loss of his wife, while death of a spouse was an unfamiliar concept to Calhoun. Jackson had a more wild and hard life, even though Calhoun had multiple children die. However, Jackson, for all of his uncouth ways, was more politically successful, whereas Calhoun dealt with many political struggles. Calhoun was involved in a political career that really determined a lot of what was to come in the next 30 years. He had many different offices and represented the South during the antebellum period. Jackson represented the American frontier and was a Democratic president loved by the people. Although these two men were political enemies, their personal histories forever lie intertwined.
Calhoun began as a strong nationalist. He was educated at Yale College and Litchfield Law School, both very nationalist schools. As a politician, he devoted himself to internal improvements, that is, the construction and maintenance of roads, bridges, canals, railroads, harbor facilities, and so on. He was often known as the young Hercules who carried the war on his shoulders. John Quincy Adams remarked that he is above all sectional and factious prejudices more than any other statesman of this Union with whom I have ever acted. He ran for president multiple times but never succeeded. As the years went by, he began leaning towards nullification. Finally, in 1831, he openly admitted his commitment to nullification. The tariffs of 1828 and 1838, both of which he fiercely opposed, were probably the most significant reasons for his change. He was also strongly opposed to abolition. Calhoun's nullification separated him from Jackson, with whom he served as vice president. Their differences grew obvious during the Eaton affair. Calhoun backed the scandal, while Jackson fiercely opposed it. In the end, Jackson accused Calhoun of treachery. A few years later, when the nullification crisis arose, the two men were bitterly opposed. Jackson even wanted to hang Calhoun for treason. The crisis ended with the Compromise of 1833, but Calhoun retained both his nullification and his contempt for Jackson.
Though Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun were once the President and Vice President of America, their views were extremely different. Animosity separated the two men, starting with the Eaton affair of 1830. Jackson noticed that Calhoun's wife, Floride, among others, was publicly snubbing cabinet member John Eaton's wife, Margaret Peggy Eaton, by spreading scandalous stories about her first husband and forcing her into isolation. Jackson sympathized with Peggy Eaton, for he had endured rumors about his own wife, Rachel, who was said to have married Jackson before she was divorced from her first husband and acted extremely masculine, smoking a pipe. Some even say that this constant gossiping even led to her death. Jackson saw the Eaton ordeal as a plot formulated by Calhoun to drive Eaton out of the cabinet and take over his administration. Jackson accused Calhoun of treachery and ended all social ties with him. Other separations between the two men had purely political grounds. Certain acts passed by Jackson, known as part of the American system, were seen by Southerners as nothing more than a way for Northern states to draw money away from Southern states. As Senator of South Carolina, Calhoun especially hated the new system. He was a strong supporter of liberty, feeling that the states had the freedom to declare a law unconstitutional within its borders if they desired. Andrew Jackson was a powerful politician of the time, and Calhoun hoped to win his support, so his new nullification doctrine might be federally approved. Calhoun caught his answer at a political dinner in 1830. Jackson stood up and, while staring directly at Calhoun, made a toast. "Our federal Union, it must be preserved." Afterwards, Calhoun said, "The Union, next to our liberty, the most dear." From then on, Jackson and Calhoun were political enemies. Jackson once even responded so strongly as to declare that he would march an army into the heart of South Carolina and hang him. Jackson and Calhoun, originally partners in office, were now bitter enemies.
John C. Calhoun was a fickle character. His views were ever-changing, and he never quite agreed with anybody. To examine how he felt about something is to look at each stage of his life and his viewpoint then. Calhoun and Jackson were famous for abolishing the Second Bank of the U.S., much to the dismay of Nicholas Biddle, but Calhoun started his political career as a nationalist, and most nationalists supported the Bank of the U.S. When Calhoun entered politics in 1810, he was a member of the War Hawk Party, along with Speaker of the House Henry Clay. War Hawks were known advocates of war, and Calhoun believed the U.S. should enter the War of 1812. After the war, Calhoun became a nationalist, pushing for high tariffs and internal improvements. Calhoun also fought for the Bank of the U.S. At this point in time, had he personally known Jackson, he would have certainly wanted him to be on currency. Sectionalism was the enemy, and the War of 1812 was a national cause. All Americans would unite to celebrate a war hero, whether from the South or the North. In 1817, Calhoun became Secretary of War, and he was still imbued with nationalistic feelings. In fact, many of the institutions he came to abhor, including the Bank of the U.S., were the things he advocated during the years 1817 to 1825. In 1824, Calhoun tried to run for president, but failed to elicit support from South Carolina, so he had to settle for becoming vice president. In a close election, Calhoun witnessed John Quincy Adams become president instead of Andrew Jackson, based on the vote of the House of Representatives, though Jackson won the popular vote. That caused Calhoun to turn against nationalism, and this turn against nationalism was a turn against the Bank of the U.S. His relations with Andrew Jackson, however, remained friendly. Calhoun would have opposed hard cash, but if he thought that anybody should be represented on the bill, it would be Jackson. During his early years as vice president to Andrew Jackson, Calhoun would not have wanted Jackson on the bill. Calhoun and Jackson both abhorred the Bank of the U.S., and Jackson is on the currency of an institution he hated so much, the bank. In fact, Calhoun once said, "A power has risen up in the government greater than the people themselves, consisting of many and various and powerful interests, combined into one mass, and held together by the cohesive power of the vast surplus in the banks." Calhoun would have seen it as an insult to honor such a fine leader in an ugly way. He hated hard cash, and would have thought it should be printed with traders like Benedict Arnold on the front. An insult, not a compliment. But Calhoun and Jackson were just too different to be political allies. After the Peggy Eaton affair, Calhoun became favoring states' rights, and Jackson believed in a strong national government. Calhoun became a symbol for nullification, which Jackson despised. The enormity of their animosity was demonstrated at a state dinner, where Calhoun made a toast, saying, "The Union, next to liberty, most dear." Jackson countered his attack by stating, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." The relationship between these two major political forces was completely demolished. Calhoun bitterly resigned from the vice presidency. He was bitter about Jackson's importance, and this is where he might have begun to think it appropriate that sometime in the future Jackson would be on the bill, insulted for eternity. Calhoun never got over his fight with Jackson. Both were embittered until they died and never hesitated to insult the other. Calhoun may have felt that Jackson did not deserve glory by being on the $20 bill. Andrew Jackson is forever associated with his pet bees, but Calhoun has sunk into anonymity.
Calhoun and nullification. John C. Calhoun was a well-known supporter of states' rights and limited government. In order to maintain his position opposing the tariff of 1828, Calhoun proceeded to pen South Carolina's controversial Ordinance of Nullification in 1832. This ordinance meant that each state in the Union had the right to, quote, nullify or invalidate any federal law which the state has deemed unconstitutional, end quote. The basis for the nullification doctrine is the Union is comprised of individual and sovereign states, which hold the final authority regarding the restriction or expansion of the central government. Taking this theory to its extreme, it also gives each state the right to secede at any time. If a state can nullify federal law, why not nullify political association as well? As one would expect, this ordinance of nullification was certainly an apple of discord in an already divisive environment. It led to the famous confrontation between President Jackson and Vice President Calhoun when Jackson toasted, "Our federal union, may it be preserved," and Calhoun countered, "The union next to liberty, most dear." Obviously, the ambitious Calhoun saw, he was unlikely to receive any support from Jackson in his race for the presidency. So on July 14, 1832, Calhoun resigned from his position as vice president so he could support his theory of nullification better. Jackson, in a counterattack, signed into law the Protectionist Tariff of 1832, which attempted to bandage the wound in the South that the Tariff of 1828, the Tariff of Abominations, had caused. The Tariff of 1832 was a 35% duty, which, granted, was a 10% reduction of the original tariff, but this was just slapping a Band-Aid on a flesh wound. In an act of defiance and political muscle flexing, South Carolina declared both tariffs unconstitutional and unenforceable in their state. Jackson disliked having his undeveloped efforts at compromise flung back in his face and ordered military enforcement of the tariff in South Carolina. A skirmish was narrowly avoided when Congress passed two acts: the Force Bill, which allowed the President the power of military enforcement of the tariff, and a new tariff, which was negotiated to the satisfaction of the South Carolinians. On March 11, 1833, the South Carolina Convention repealed the Nullification Ordinance, and a tenuous peace once again settled over this issue. But Calhoun's nullification doctrine had already planted the seeds of secession, seeds which would come to fruition 3 decades later, at the eve of the Civil War.
John C. Calhoun was a strong supporter of nullification. He thought of it as a necessity for the states to preserve the rights of the people. He expressed this when he said, quote, "The Union next to our liberty most dear," end quote. He thought nullification was necessary for the Americans in the South to keep their rights and proclaimed, quote, "The denial of the right of the state to interfere constitutionally in the last resort more alarms the thinking than all other causes," end quote. The issue on nullification was very controversial, and there are many different opinions on it. Another supporter of nullification was Robert B. Hayne, the governor of South Carolina. He stated that South Carolina would no longer follow the rest of the Union because he thought too much power in the government was evil when he said, quote, "South Carolina, after 10 years of unavailing petitions and remonstrances against a system of measures on the part of the federal government, which, in common with the other southern states, she has repeatedly declared to be founded in usurpation, utterly subversive of the rights and fatal to the prosperity of her people, has, in the face of the world, put herself upon her sovereignty and made the solemn declaration that this system shall no longer be enforced within her limits." With Thomas Jefferson, she would regard the dissolution of our Union with them as one of the greatest of evils. Not the greatest, there is one greater: submission to a government without limitation of powers, end quote. There were also many people who did not support nullification and disliked Calhoun. This included President Andrew Jackson and Daniel Webster. Jackson eventually said that nullification would be illegal. He stated at the dinner with Calhoun, quote, "Our Union, it must be preserved," end quote. He thought if the states had too much power, then the Union would fall apart, and on this he said, quote, "Fellow citizens of the United States, the threat of unallowed disunion, the names of those once respected by whom it is uttered, the array of military force to support it, denote the approach of a crisis in our affairs in which the continuance of our unexampled prosperity, our political existence, and perhaps that of all free governments may depend," end quote. Daniel Webster agreed with Jackson's views and thought if the state could nullify federal law, then it would eventually lead to the government falling apart. In a speech of his he said, quote, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable," end quote. Henry Clay was also involved with this issue and was more in the middle on the issue. He was known as the Great Compromiser. He wanted to eliminate the issue by making both sides happy. As a result, Congress put into place a compromise tariff to make the South Carolinians back down. Clay was the one to put the issue to rest, but it was not truly solved, and the issues between the different parties continued.
Andrew Jackson was continually ailed by a musket ball lodged in his lung, an old dueling wound. He was frequently in poor health and sporadically coughed up blood. On June 8, 1845, Jackson died at the age of 78 in his home, the Hermitage, from tuberculosis, dropsy, and heart failure. Jackson was buried in a resplendent memorial at his home, beside his beloved wife Rachel. John C. Calhoun worked until his death, having other orators deliver his speeches in Senate when he was too ill to speak. In March 1850, Calhoun died of tuberculosis while in Washington, D.C. He was buried in a somewhat decrepit vault, all but forgotten. John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson, two politicians during the 1830s, had drastically differing views of the early American government. Jackson, President of the United States, promoted nationalism and a strong union. Calhoun favored the idea that a state could nullify federal laws if it so desired. Jackson was furious that Calhoun would defy the Union so dramatically, and he publicly displayed his anger to this Southern senator. With two such opposing views, who would Americans follow? Who would they choose to remember? It is Jackson who we remember today, Jackson who has made it into the heads of every school child and onto our paper currency. It is somewhat ironic that we would honor Jackson in this way, given Jackson's opposition to paper money. Nonetheless, one thing is certain: John C. Calhoun would not approve.